Hello everyone, today we talk about Edward I's government, some aspects of the same, because this is perhaps the ruler that Schwerpunkt covered the most in absolute terms across the entire continent. An extraordinary figure and one of the great kings in English history, having, by the way, from a character point of view, a reputation of fierceness and sometimes unpredictability in temper, which apparently made him intimidating. There are a bunch of examples apparently signifying this, such as with the death of the Dean of St. Paul, a member and chair of the chapter of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, that seeking to confront the king regarding high taxation in 1295 collapsed and passed away in Edward's presence. These are more anecdotes than anything, but of course, like one would always risk in make a psychological, let's say, portrait of a medieval sovereign. What I insist on rather is considering the energy and the capacities that this man had, and therefore how truly perennial in their intentions, right? How enduring and resilient they were, and so also how intimidating and strong their presence really was, right? As we will see now, in 13th century France and England, there was, as you know, the development of the further development of a concept of kings' sacrality, that these men were called to really impersonate, right? To incarnate better. The contemporary French King Philip the Fair was said to have been publicly impassible, so that he wouldn't move to symbolize that absolute perfection, according to for example, the current universal Aristotelian Thomistic ideas of the great cathedral that the medieval civilization is at this point. England was a very important kingdom, and its ruler had to, of course, to reflect this in part as well. We have mentioned, of course, that Edward, again, was a warrior king. There were, many reasons for his authoritarian, sort of iron-fisted behavior. 14th century Chronicle attributes the death of the Archbishop Thomas of York, Thomas of Corbridge, 1299-1304 as Archbishop of York, to Edward's harsh behavior towards him. Again, this is almost anecdotal. However, there is also something you see, of course, dramatized in some funny way in the movie Braveheart, when Longshank is quite, intolerant, let's put it in this way, towards his son's acquaintances. And this is styled after, in fact, the episode in which Edward of Sternern, Edward the second Prince of Wales, demanded an earldom for his favorite Piers Gaveston. By the way, we'll talk about Edward II more after Edward I, because I'm kind of, at this point, you see, for the regional series of England, I don't have many options, because yes, there are all the various English counties, some of which are definitely worth introducing that sort of provincial series. At this point, Sovereign's History, which is, I think, what this series will evolve into when we will run out of regions, at least for Europe, which is, of course, not happening anytime soon. However, many countries we have somehow already exhausted in the essentials, so we can look at some smaller polity entity, whatever, but the ruler's option is quite interesting. With England, I'm going by, in chronological order. Perhaps we will not immediately cover every king in succession, but let's say we'll talk about the general era, general generation. For Edward I, there is just so much that is very fascinating to go in depth. However, we already made a video about Edward II, specifically his government of Aquitaine. All right. In any case, in this incident, you have Piers Gaveston was again the favorite of Edward II, that received a very unfavorable press in many ways. So it's not just like the meme of the feminated, sort of gender fluid kind of game. But of course, there are these historical recorded episodes. Gaveston in particular was a nobleman of Gascon origin, and the in fact cherished companion of Edward, of what would become Edward II. And so at that point, Edward I, his father erupted with anger and reportedly pulled out handfuls of Edward of Cernerborn's hair at that point, which is a sort of very violent and sort of dissatisfied way of acting with your own son and heir to the throne. Now, many of Edward's contemporaries found the king frightening, particularly during his early years of reign. There is a Latin poem, the Song of Blues, talking about the Battle of 1264, that, as you know, had been a big deal in the Civil War at the time of Henry III, and so when the young Edward was also involved in this. It's a work consisting of 968 lines in Goliardic style, recording, celebrating, and justifying the opponent of the royal house, that is Simon de Montfort, that was eventually cut to pieces after this. And Edward, the young Edward in that case, is described this zoomorphic parallelism as a leopard, right? And in that fashion regarded as particularly powerful and unpredictable. Actually, the leopard was the panther, but medieval bestiaries tended to mix that. Considered these animals to be particularly sensual in many ways. This doesn't seem to be specifically the actual parallelism with Edward, but it may have simply been a way to ridiculize him, but still highlighting a fierce character. For the rest, Edward was seen, however, as a good man, right? He was notably devoted to his family, for example. He had overall, of course, a gentler disposition than the one, accentuated for those examples. He was very close to his daughters, for example. He gifted them frequently. By the way, they often visited the court at the same time, so there's a very strong connection. We've seen it in other videos also with his wife, to whom he was quite close, and he suffered very much when she died. There are all the various Eleanor stones and her funerary path across England, which was rare, right? He was also one of the few faithful kings of the era. She had, if you remember, saved his life when he was stabbed in the Holy Land by a poisoned knife handled by one of the famous assassins, right? The sect of the Nizarites that we've seen probably also took out great figures in the past, like Conrad of Montferrat. Eleanor sucked off the venom out of her husband's wound, right? Likely saving his life. Edward had definitely a harsh demeanor, however, he was liked for this by his contemporaries that described him as even an ideal king, other than just an able one definitely not just worth of the throne, but of all the deeds that sort of he embarked himself in, from the Crusades to the conquest of Wales, to the wars with Scotland, and more. Even when his subjects disliked him, they feared and respected him at the same time. There were no armed rebellions in England during his reign, which is in part an indicator at least of the competence, the capacity, therefore the deterrent force that Edward maintained during his reign. It was also quite, It was quite stable one for this reason, but also a hard one, considering that the many wars, we will see now the exactions required from the English. Edward is recognized for a certain vindictiveness towards his defeated enemies, also for some sort of celebration, triumphalism in his actions, which can be sort of criticized. In fact, some scholars believe that Edward had a habit of belittling his opponents, right? And this was perhaps one of the worst aspects of his persona, which, however, may show how much of an actual power he had, and therefore how confident he felt in, of course, of opposing enemies that at large were in fact really weaker than him. There are some examples. He seized the fragments of the Holy Cross from Wales after the conquest in 1283. We know, we talked about in the video about the Great Cause, how Edward captured the Stone of Scone and regalia from Scotland following the war 1296. You know that this was returned just some decades ago. Like the Stone of Scone was under properly Edward's throne and remained there up to recently before it was returned to Scotland. So definitely he was a very impositive ruler. We've seen it well again in his interference in Scottish affairs, the way he postured himself as however also other English rulers had really done, considering this sort of subordinate clienterly relation existing between the much more powerful England, in fact the subordinate Scotland historically. So while Edward essentially started the so-called, in return to that, of course, the Scottish wars of Scottish independence, say he was definitely in a particular condition that favored such expansionistic policy, without mentioning that, as you know, his father had fundamentally pursued a more conservative, isolationistic policy ever since probably the trauma that he had suffered, considering his own father's experience. That Edward's father was Henry III, his grandfather was, in fact, John of England, when, in fact, the English lost a great deal of, in fact, almost all their French domains. And so Edward I especially is the consequence of this partial withdrawal from the continent and the reorientation, let's say, of English expansionism towards the rest of Britain. Very successful one, by the way, if you think about Wales, right? However, some scholars point this aspect out, that Edward was probably expressing contempt towards the Celtic French. He doesn't seem to have displayed a great deal of good faith and trustworthiness in his dealings with Wales and Scotland. So, in many ways, he could be that shrewd to, of course, adapt himself to the circumstance. Some would say that he was double-faced, but honestly, I can't think of very specific examples. However, again, we will talk about all these various aspects in other videos, including one belonging to the same series, especially as far as the wars with Scotland are concerned. In any case, there is no doubt, and that's one of the reasons why I like very much this king, is that he really embodies that 13th century great Western monarchic standard, right? He was definitely meeting with the historical expectation of kingship of the time. He was definitely a great knight, right? It was also a necessity for a king at the time. He definitely shared chivalric ideals, lifestyle. England really had a great time under his reign. He was also religious, right? He attended chapel regularly, he gave alms generously, he demonstrated a fervent devotion to the Virgin Mary and St. Thomas Becket. So embodying that way also pretty English, regarding especially the latter, of course, martyred the English piety, like in a truly national sense. Remember that he was called Edward by his father, who was quite devout to Edward the Confessor, and so yet another character of Englishness rather than Frenchness, like as these rulers were essentially originally of, in that re-Britishization, in a sense, of the English monarchy. Edward was also actively participant in the tradition of the royal touch, like his father. For example, he was believed to be able of curing people afflicted with scrofula. Was really typical of that, I guess, again, especially English and French tradition. Contemporary accounts show that Edward personally touched the lives of over 1,000 individuals each year. It was also a sign of broader responsibility, considering that they did have an idea, of course, of the risks even of such contact in general, not just for people affected by particular known diseases, but say general exposure. It was a very risky life, as you know. Edward at some point fell literally from a tower, because within the same tower that the floor broke, and he was about to die actually in that incident. Despite his deep sense of personal piety, Edward often found himself at odds with the archbishops of Canterbury, who held office during his reign for, of course, political reasons, ecclesiastical policy regarding the general contributions, also for war and so on. His relationship with the papacy was frequently strained as well, right? And the problem being, in fact, always the same. Essentially, the disputes with Rome over ecclesiastical taxation, because, of course, the general tendency of these kings was to sort of nationalize their own church. Tendentially think about Gallicanism in France. So these are, you can't say really proto-Protestant concept, because they didn't really believe at all the theology of it, but there was an attempt, of course, to patronize and control the Church of England, tying her assets, her incomes, and its taxation what had to be sent to Rome, or ever more actually to the monarchy instead. Edward definitely utilized the church for wartime mobilization. We talked about this in the video about Edward's Statute of Winchester 1285 that would remain in use up to the beginning of the 15th century. That was in fact quite demanding in many ways, and of course trying to homogenize the classes of recruitment, but also extending such demands, like in parallel to the statute. This is what these rulers, especially his descendants, would try to do. I mean his immediate descendants, of course, Edward II, Edward III especially. Edward issued writs to England's archbishops to spread justifications for war, therefore providing a solid ideological framework to especially the conquest. Like if you look at Wales or Scotland, never forget that the attribution of paganism, and this in fact more superstitiously non-Catholic and inferior, like kind of idea of liberty and of autonomy of the weaker, was of course a great deal of traditional identity. The same England had actually been conquered by the Normans through a veritable crusade wanted by the Pope, even though there wasn't any apparent theological issue. But the idea that the barbarian, right, has to be to be brought under. This is a just enterprise to civilize them, etc., is something that these kings still had in their veins quite strong, because there was that actual difference. We are the ones who tend to flatten everything and to say, oh, well, one kingdom was more or less like the other. No, they weren't, right? There is a rigid hierarchy in the cultural superiority and inferiority of a people. Furthermore, Edward's architectural endeavors carried a propagandistic purpose too. This is the great age of the Gothic cathedrals, of universal theories. Edward's father, Henry III, made a video about this quite universal ambitions regarding the displaying of the romanity of his sepulchre, for example, after Roman architecture, I mean specifically medieval Roman architecture of that era. There was, of course, a general purpose of blending messages of religious devotion in one's life, and in consecrating the memory of the royal house members, for example. You can see this in the construction of Eleanor crosses, as we were saying before. Edward had also, and this is very interesting, a strong fascination with the tales of King Arthur, which enjoyed considerable popularity across Europe during his reign. This is also true before this time. For example, I made a video about the Italian knights of, it was like at the end of the 80s, if I'm not wrong, the 12th century, from the very famous iconography of the legend of King Arthur's relief on Modena's cathedral, right? And that tells you how, you think, the Arthurian legends being, so much just a hallmark just of Britishness, but at the time, of course, they were known far and wide, and in chivalric Europe, in this literary context, like especially French literature has spread this far and wide, but England had injected, and Britain as well actually, had injected a great deal of this from quite a long time. In fact, we often forget it. Even, for example, Gothic architecture in the original insight was not even a French thing. I mean, the French developed it at the utmost, but basically the English did it before conceptually and also in parallel in terms just of the beautiful Gothic architecture of the time. And Edward was really living in those times. So the legends of King Arthur became predictably ever more important after Edward conquered Wales, because of course this was a Romano-Brittonic leader. Like the story back in the day, of course, was fighting actually the terrible and fierce Saxons, right, and fencing them off of Britain, or at least stopping their expansion in the west of the British Isles. I made a video about the so-called Arthurian age, I mean the actual one in terms of army organization at that time of early medieval Britain. But of course this was also a broader model of general courtly standards, aside from probably the literary let's say embellishment and development, but there is a lot of archetypal hardcore values in this that were perfectly fitting with the highest peaks, in fact, of feudal monarchic power. In 1278, Edward visited Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset to unveil what was believed at the time to be the tomb of the same Arthur and Guinevere. Naturally, this alone tells you how obsessed they actually were at the time, how sort of relevant and historical the Arthurian cycle really was. After conquering North Wales specifically, Edward claimed literally Arthur's crown from the most powerful and local ruler, Llywelyn. It was really a mark of imposition on the Welsh in that case. We know, we've seen it again, because I made other videos about Edward. If you I haven't created a playlist about him specifically, but if you search for the medieval England one, you can easily find them. So also there are reasons that they're more or less all together there. Edward is famous for his campaign to build castles throughout Wales. So the many and beautiful Welsh castles dating to Edward I, so one of the great landmarks in Europe still today. And these were in some ways inspired by the Arthurian legions themselves, both in their design and locations. Much of this was legend, as just like the Arthurian ones are, but there was, I made a video about the traditional meaning of space, and not just that, the one also about sacred royalty, etc. is incredibly important. So the continuity of power in time and across time, across but also in specific places, was really part of that milieu. Edward even orchestrated so-called round table events in 1284 and 1302. This featured tournaments, feasts. Chroniclers of the time would draw parallels naturally between him and King Arthur. In certain cases, Edward appeared, of course, to manipulate this Arthurian legacy to advance his exquisite political objectives. None of this was merely an abstract fixation, right? It wasn't any sense of, in fact, of truly like fictional escapism, especially from a leader. The main reason why Edward was manipulating the Arthurian legions was legitimizing his rule in Wales, and therefore undermining probably the Welsh spirit and morale, showing that their King Arthur would not return as a political savior, and it actually was the English who were stronger and had been able to win the Arthurian legacy for themselves, together, of course, with the rule of Wales. Shortly after ascending the throne, Edward embarked on a mission to restore order and reaffirm royal authority following his father's troubled reign, or at least the last parts of it, because otherwise, like the beginning and the mid reign of Henry III was quite almost uneventful because of the peace in it, but that in fact stretched too much the court, and everything sort of not crumbled but sort of broke out instead at the end of the reign. Edward had found himself in that, so he had to fix his own kingdom of England now that he came to rule. And in order to accomplish this, he swiftly ordered a thorough overhaul of administrative personnel. The civil wars, as you know, had been a major issue since the wreckage of the White Ship that had engulfed the country periodically. This was really normal if you look at other medieval countries and kingdoms. However, there was much in terms of probably English public authority and power concentration potential that, of course, was disrupted by these events. And so Edward, as we've seen, was a pretty volitive and impositive ruler, so he wanted to put things back together. A key change in personnel was the appointment of Robert Bernal as Chancellor in 1234. This man remained in office until 1292. He became, in fact, one of Edward's closest advisors. And in the same 1274, the king replaced most local officials, such as the executors and sheriffs. So probably down at the local level, these were the enforcers of royal authority. In many ways, they had been bought off by the barons. Always remember that the English barons had a very, and would maintain, in fact, also in the following centuries, a very close connection with their earldoms. There wasn't really such robust, administration run by, for example, bourgeois, like in the much bigger French system, taking shape. So it was easy for the barons that historically had counter, of course, monarchic power to sort of buy also the local officials off, because this didn't have the same power that they had somewhere else. And so these provisions were part of a larger effort from the side of Edward to conduct an extensive investigation throughout England as well, because those officials were the ones that had been historically in place to receive the complaints regarding abuses of power, but now they had turned into the same abusers. So Edward wanted, remember his vindicative character, to fix things, really, while also determining what lands and rights the crown had lost during Henry III's reign. Right. So the enactment of a sort of cadastre for medieval standards that, as you know, was not the first time it had occurred in English history. In fact, this is perhaps an overlooked aspect of Edward's reign, his legal and administrative reforms. Edward's inquiry across England led to the creation of a series of census documents known as the 100 Rolls that specifically pertain to his era. And these rolls definitely share a similarity with the 11th century Domesday Book, the most famous record commissioned by King William the Conqueror, that detailed much of England as well as parts of Wales in 1086. So just, in the first generation after the Norman settlement, that was necessary in order to mostly claim suzerainty over the many, not just Norman, but as also Flemish, Brittonic adventurers that in some cases had arrived had created a seigneury in Britain even before 1066. And so extending, of course, the royal authority over them was quite relevant in terms of income, etc. Now, in Edward's reign, England was much tidier. Wales was basically annexed at this point. So it was a very good moment to reinforce such administrative net, this capillary taxation. The 100 Rolls laid also the groundwork for subsequent legal inquiries known in civil law as the quo warranto proceedings. These inquiries essentially aim to establish the basis, and this is the point, the quo warranto, what the warrant, upon which liberties were held. If a defendant could not provide a royal license to validate their claim to a liberty, asserted that such liberties should return to the king. There were naturally many jurisprudential bases for this kind of ideas. For example, already from the times of Henry III, you have the prominent legal scholar Henry de Bracton spreading such royalistically legitimizing conceptions in the country. The Statute of Westminster of 1275, as well as the one of 10 years later, that are very important, like in the full settlement property, like much of the Kingdom of England institutional basis codify, in fact, the pre-existing laws in England. By enacting the Statute of Gloucester in 1278, Edward challenged specifically baronial rights through the revival of the system of general heirs. That is to say, royal justices traveling throughout the land, and significantly increased the number of quo warranto pleas to be heard by the heirs. This again manifests how strongly in control Edward was of the country. No baronial revolts. There are chances, of course, to reward the aristocrats with the new conquests in the Celtic French, but at large there is also the shared necessity by an important part of the country to reinforce monarchic power and to put England on a better footing through power concentration. Needless to say, this initiative sparked significant resistance among the aristocracy. That would not, however, escalate in violence. The nobility argued that long-standing usage alone constituted a valid claim, so that the king could not simply recover, whatever he wanted from a long time before. A compromise was thus reached in 1290, stipulating that a liberty would be considered legitimate only if it could be shown to have been exercised since the coronation of Richard the Lionheart in 1189. It should, however, be pointed out that the gains from the Quo Warranto proceedings were minimal. Right? Only a few liberties were actually relinquished to the king. Much about this was just restoring an idea of order and the fact that, that the crown's prerogatives were properly affirmed in a juridical framework that would eventually work for the future as well. And in fact, overall, there was a general gain, general victory for Edward. Essentially, as we were pointing out before, laying the basis for a much greater institutional stability, a bloodless legal affirmation of the crown over the nobility, and the later, in fact, application of these new norms. The 1290 Statute of Quo Warranto was just one element of a broader legislative reform that stands, in fact, as one of the most significant achievements of Edward's reign. It couldn't be fought just over, whatever land could be recovered from the nobility, having been previously as illicitly occupied. This period of legislative activity began in Edward's reign during the baronial reform movement. Pretty early on, where you have the State of Marlborough in 1267 incorporating aspects from both the provisions of Oxford that were, as you know, essentially even more important than the Magna Carta, telling you the truth, as well as the dictum of Kenilworth. Right, the statutes of Winchester were essentially the seal over the new, say, asset that the English monarchy had undergone since the Magna Carta, sort of rebalancing the limitations the barons had placed on the crown. You have also the dictum of Kenilworth at this point, when the compilation of the 100 Rolls was followed by the Westminster establishments. The first one in 1275, the second in 1285. In between, you have the statutes of Mortmain, which was very important, 1279, addressing the issue of land grants to the church. Westminster second was known as De Donis Conditionalibus, that essentially regulated family land settlements and entails, right? In Latin, it simply means what the general principle behind it. What kind of conditions are there for these gifts? Are they lawful? How do they have to? Because in a great feudal society where most of the proceedings are private, right, are oligarchic, and in fact the higher levels, there was a significant distribution of assets that had to be regulated. You have the Statute of Merchants in 1285, regulating debt recovery. Of course, the economy was improving at that time. We're at the peak of the great medieval civilization. We will see now also the role of the Italian bankers. The Statute of Winchester, 1285, was the excuse me, I think I confused actually Westminster with Winchester. The Westminster 1 and 2 are the ones that, as we were saying before, reinforce the Clarendon Constitution, all that trail from the Magna Carta over. Then you have the Statute of Winchester, 1285, that enhances the local security and law enforcement, right? So more police, general societal control. Then you have the Quia Emptores Statute, 1290, issued along the Quo Varanto itself, seeking to resolve land ownership disputes stemming from sub-infeudation, which was also, in fact, another common practice to earn, to invest others, etc., of the main burdens, especially for war. So actually, the statute of Winchester addressed also the recruitment laws we were talking about it the other day. The great legislative era of Edward III ended with the death of Robert Bernal in 1292. Right after this, in Edward's reign, there wouldn't be much of another great legal activity. In the meanwhile, however, there had been other important reforms, for example, a comprehensive one of the coinage system. In fact, by 1279, coinage had significantly deteriorated. The new coins issued were of superior quality compared to those in circulation when Edward ascended the throne, so showing how reliable the kingdom was and how much it had enriched for this higher level of precious metal in them. Edward minted pennies, half pennies, and farthings, plus a new coin denomination called the groat. I inserted some images here from Edward's reign. The latter was unsuccessful, but in general, the coin production process improved. Right, the moneyar William Turnemeyer implemented, for example, an innovative method of cutting blank coins from a silver roll to placing the older method of stamping them from sheets. This technique proved to be more efficient with less metal dispersion. Edward's rule saw the practice of minting coins with the moneyer's name becoming obsolete. Right, the mint administration in England had become too centralized under the control of the authority of the crown to allow for this. That hypostatization of the same monarchy had prompted this more homogeneous type of power representation on the coins themselves. During this time, English coins were frequently counterfeited on the continent, particularly in the Low Countries, because of the intense trade existing with England, the eternal, shipping of English wool to the Flemish textile markets, and from there to the Champagne fairs and beyond. There was a ban in 1283, of course, to limit such counterfaction, and this, however, is yet another indicator of how, qualitative English currency was. There were secret ways to export it to Europe as well, of course, unlawful ones were persecuted. In August 1280, Edward prohibited the use of the old long cross coinage, forcing the populace to switch to the newly minted coins. This helped a great deal the English currency stability, right? The coinage reform was overall successful, and this is much also to Edward's, again, general administrative credit. All this, again, was not just for accumulating surplus. On the contrary, Edward's frequent military campaigns imposed a considerable as constant financial burden on the nation. So the kingdom was fluidifying the means to achieve broader expansion. Politically, financially, Edward had several avenues for raising funds for war, of course, including custom duties, loans, lay subsidies. Overall, this 13th century states, even though incredibly advanced, of course, could not simply, cover all the expenses by simple taxation. But of course, it was a general attempt to return to that ever more frequently. Taxes were levied usually on a specific fraction of the movable property of all laymen. In 1275, Edward negotiated an agreement with domestic merchants to establish a permanent duty on wool, naturally in exchange for some mercantile prerogatives, monopolies. Wool, as we just recalled, was England's primary export and actually would remain for a very long time. So by tying especially London's mob and its strong mercantile activities to the crown, this was a quite interesting mechanism, institutionalizing such mercantile subsidies. There was a similar agreement in 1303 with foreign merchants as well, in exchange, of course, for certain rights and privileges. This would also counter, in fact, the prerogatives of the English merchants that could become too greedy at that point. And naturally, the privileged foreigners were the Italians, that at this point were really peaking in terms of financiary capacity. I made so many videos about the Italian financiary hegemony in this period. We can essentially talk already about early banking. And when you look at all the wars between France and England, you realize that great part of the money found by the respective crowns did come from Italy. In this case, Edward relied on the Riccardi, a group of bankers from Lucca, Tuscany, that was in fact quite an interesting source of different, not just financial, but also human material. For example, the famous Castruccio Castracani, the later lord of the same Lucca, also immortalized by Machiavelli, and also the author of the great Victor Rivalto Pasha, was a favorite at Edward's court at this point. So the very interesting figures. We're talking mercenaries involved in Flanders itself. Remember that at this point, you see that the agreement in 1303 with the Italians corresponds also with essentially the French invasion of Flanders, which had been, in fact, a major red flag for England regarding her international role, and this, again, the French attempt to bring Flanders under the direct control of the kingdom by also ousting the English presence. And you do find, in fact, a lot of the Italians were very present in the Flemish market, and so there were different factions of this as well. Many fought for the same. Castruccio apparently fought for the King of France eventually in Flanders. So it's a very shaded situation. We'll have to talk about the Franco-Flemish War, because really, aside we covered the Battle of Kortrijk, but it's a much more complicated and important deal. So these Italian bankers, in return for their services as essentially moneylenders to the crown, again, the Italians had a monstrous surplus in it. There was no, way of matching really. The king would provide them with specific assets and monopolies. For example, the conquest of Wales was funded by this money. When the war with France also erupted, which we have seen in other videos about Edward, the French king confiscated the Ricardis' assets, which also led to the bank's bankruptcy, right? You know that there is this Lombard presence, in London there is even the Lombard Street, here we are at the time of Philip IV, the trial against the Templars, the confiscation of the Jewish property of the Italian money. This was routinely happening because these mastodontic kingdoms required constantly an ever larger amount of resources to be competitive with one another. In many ways, this is also the prelude to the 100 Years' War, fought by Edward's grandson. Now, the Frescobaldi family from Florence eventually became the new moneylenders to the English crown, considering the Riccardi's demise. This is also an interesting alignment, because you see that it's a very much like ad personam connection. Like this Riccardi, Frescobaldi were not really the representative of, say, the Lucchese or the Florentine government, respectively. They were just privates, right? And they decided to invest. They had many branches out there, and again, that crucial hub between like England, Flanders, and France was very frequented by them to begin with, so they would know how to take these opportunities. Edward also attempted to ease financial strains by helping his wife Eleanor establishing an independent income. This was a very relevant aspect, especially at the courtly level, that the various members of the royal household would need to have steady income for maintaining, in fact, their same one. Another path to obtain consensus in such troubled times, of course, was the regular convenement of Parliament. Edward did so throughout his reign. There is an important change in this policy in 1295. In fact, for the latter Parliament, in addition to the secular and ecclesiastical lords, 2 knights from each county and 2 representatives from each borough were summoned. This was not really new, but this authority, let's say the authority under which these representatives were called, was unprecedented. In fact, before 1295, the Commons were expected to defer the decisions made by the magnates, while now was declared that they should convene with the full authority, the plena potestas of their communities, to give assent to decisions made in Parliament. This is incredibly relevant because it meant that was all a backbone of not just of baronial power, but in fact of their own retinues, of their own knights that had to give assent. So as another estate, practically, in the Parliament to the decisions that were taken. There were similar proceedings, say, in Germany. They also were gradually fading. Also, this aspect, of course, in England would leave room for some more oligarchic arrangements. But at this point, it was quite relevant because in the 13th century, society was still fairly well balanced up, and actually the lower estates had somehow increased in power, especially the knights. England did not have a great deal of communal autonomy. We made a video explaining this, especially as far as the English peasantry was concerned. But these forces were very much connected with that sort of down the lower levels of the core of England, and so this is a great endeavor. Naturally, Parliament was the occasion which also the contribution for the war mostly were levied, so the monarch had to make a point why it was the case for requiring such subsidies, and different regulations had to be accommodated. So the 1295 shift allowed Edward to collect lay subsidies from the entire population, practically. Henry III, for example, had only managed to collect 4 such subsidies during his reign. Edward now obtained 9, and through this much more sort of impulsive and widely recognizing, wider autonomy recognition of other estates in this institutional framework. This is 1295, what the historians would call later in British historiography, the model parliament, because this would become the standard for literally all the future parliaments, right? William Stubbs came up with that term, but indeed, this arrangement stemmed from Edward the First, showing, by the way, how much consensus he was able to leverage and how much political balance he thus obtained, which is not to be given for granted, especially after ages of civil wars and now expansionism that would, ideally spark some reactionary attitude towards the monarchy and its efforts. Instead, things were going toward the right direction. These were all reforms that would dramatically help also the development of the great English army of the 100 Years' War. Right, it would be finally perfected by Edward III, but that already under Edward I and Edward II, and not just in a military sense, had received this very strong basis. Right, you cannot have that efficient of an army without an adequate political and social background. Just as Philip IV was doing in France, also Edward in England enacted a policy of persecution towards the local Jewry. In England, it started in 1290. At this time, differently from Christians, Jews were permitted to charge interest on loans, known as usury, because the presumption behind this was that since the Jews would go to hell, there was no essential, care about their soul, right? But this was actually a very convenient way of allowing, in fact, usury, money lending, to degrees that, as we've seen, were actually happening all over the West by the Christians, and that, in fact, these sovereigns needed ever more. However, there were also, starting from the First Crusade and beyond, certain sentiments of broader anti-Jewish feeling that were reinforced by the church, and the idea that, the Jews would have essentially represented some extraneous, would not properly harmful body to Christian society. And Edward, in fact, enacted this persecution mostly because of the mounting pressure from the church to do so. This is interesting because, the Jews in such countries would remain, in Western Europe in general, so they would have a sort of better status condition than, say, for example, Central Europe, right? At least in general, even just comparatively to the local, local conditions. But this was a time of great regulation of these matters, and also of mounting mob hostility, which traditionally, actually, the secular and spiritual authorities had countered. Great massacres, pogroms of Jews had been avoided thanks to the establishment. Now things were getting out of hand in many ways. There was also an idea that the Jews were to be tolerated in Christendom differently from any other religion, because Christians, this was the general theological, ecumenic principle behind this, that would need a witness for the end time to prove, in fact, that Christianity was the right religion. And so the Jews, because of their proximity, the shared holy scriptures, and more, just like their historical presence in Western society, would be the sort of the predilect, group to eventually, at that point, to be sent to hell. It's as cruel as it sounds, but so it was believed. And this, however, didn't go without a great deal of actual, pride in the defense of this community, as we were pointing out before, with the establishment not wanting unrest. Most of, actually, the anti-Jewish hatred at that point had become an anti-monarchic one. because monarchs had mostly fostered the presence of Jewish moneylenders in their countries. This is especially true for Central Europe. And so there was this idea that, of course, these regions had witnessed the settlement of the Jews in very different historical times and dynamics from one another. But the sense is that, in fact, rulers had a sacred duty to protect the Jews. Next to, of course, to the practical needs of public security, stemming from, in fact, violence that could erupt against these communities. The Jews were regarded as the king's personal property. It was even probably a personal relationship. And this is why, for example, nobody but the king had the discretion to tax the Jewry as he pleased, of course. Now, the Jews in England had already been heavily taxed, right? So that this was initially enacted to make them sell their debt bonds, which had become an issue. It's actually a much more complicated topic. I will make an entire video about the persecution of the Jews under Edward I, because this was a significant amount of money. So these bonds were sold at drastically reduced prices to, of course, allow, in this case, the crown to transfer significant wealth from indebted landholders to courtiers, right? The aforementioned funding of Queen Eleanor's entourage happened also through this Jewish money. As you understand, this dynamic led to widespread resentment because it was actually enacted to mostly favor the monarchy. However, in response to such dissatisfaction, which was voiced in Parliament, Edward issued the Statute of the Jewry in 1275, which essentially prohibited interests on loans and encouraged the Jews to pursue other professions, so to even amalgamate them to the rest of society. In 1279, under the guise of crackdown on coin clippers, Edward orchestrated, however, an arrest of all heads of Jewish households in England. We're talking about roughly 300 Jews, which was actually a pretty large proportion compared to the Jewish population of England that was roughly 10 times more, so not too much. But this is the most brutal aspect. Like essentially, one Jew out of 10 was executed after capture. Others paid fines. We're talking up to £16,000 raised in this way. And through, of course, like the seizure of the properties from the killed. So it was that brutal massacre and expoliation. In 1280, Edward ordered all Jews to attend special sermons preached by Dominican friars. The objective was naturally hoping to persuade them to convert in a way or another. Dominicans, the friar minors in general, were becoming extremely important. Think about the Franciscans in Oxford, etc. They were a very important tool for monarchy, especially because these did not depend on the bishops. And so even within the same city, you could have this presence that would be loyal mostly to the papacy, but being, let's say, vinculated from the bishops, let's say, also to the monarch at the local level. Nevertheless, the conversion of the Jewry of England was unsuccessful. By that time, the Jews, by the way, were reduced to poverty. Really, they were not interesting for the crown anymore. They had been squeezed, right? Yet they had some relevance in the broader political and social landscape to negotiate something about their condition among the other estates. So essentially, as a pole. In 1290, you have the Edict of Expulsion, with which Edward formally expelled all the Jews from England. As they crossed the Channel to France, some fell victim to piracy, others were dispossessed or perished during the storms of October of that year. So this brought the crown to dispose of their property through sales and granting 85 properties to courtier and family members. It was an effective distraction of the English Jewry. There was a general motivation, as we pointed out before, deriving from not just the church but also the Parliament that had required such brutal measures to secure a lay subsidy of £110,000, actually the largest granted in the medieval period, which is also extremely interesting because it shows not just how powerful really the Kingdom of England at this point really was, it's really peaking, right? In the later Middle Ages, England wasn't so powerful, in proportion and just also in an international sense. Under Edward I, I think you can claim the greatest power, at least between Edward I and Edward III. The power is really insane, right, and quite active, as you understand. But also the most, significant aspect is that this enormous amount of money was actually levied in exchange for the sacrifice of the Jews, right? And this tells you how hostile actually the feelings at the time were towards this population. There are parallels, of course, in the rest of Europe, but it's not so effort as England and a few other places, really. So this has also to do with the great societal control that, as we've seen, the monarchy really exercised in countries like England, France, and so on. Naturally, the Jewry, as you understand, there were not so many, but especially in England, but they were particularly abated, and they lost practically everything because they had acquired that much wealth through that allowance for usury over the centuries. There had already been, in fact, other expulsions of the Jews from England, but there was not such a permanent settlement. In fact, the Jews were re-allowed in the country only in the mid-17th century, which is also fascinating because it's exactly the moment at which, instead, the monarchy was removed, and or at least controlled by the Parliament. Of course, in a completely different, you can't simply trace a parallelism, but still, the Parliament at the time needed Jewish capitals as well, and so there was this laxity, in that otherwise very harsh legislation against the Jew. Edward justified the expulsion as being, quote, in honor of the crucified. There were, just like in other countries, some accusations of treachery and criminal behavior of the Jews. Many of these were fabricated. There was really no reason why they would also want this to abate itself on them. Edward financed the renovation of the tomb of the little Saint Hugh. That was yet another example of these fabrications. This was a child that had died, and because of the false allegation to have been ritually crucified by the Jews, right? And so this is really, by the way, the tomb of the little Saint Hugh. Today, I don't think it exists anymore because it existed up to the modern era beyond. But we lost so many of some older buildings also with the modernization of England. It was very similar. In fact, we know how it was. Really, it was enough time to depict it in the same style of Eleanor crosses, right? And there was, of course, some political gain, as we have seen, to get from this reinforcements of anti-Jewish feelings for the monarchy. In British history, this was also one of the most explicit connections with the crucifix that you can monarchically draw. Edward's interest in Ireland is also interesting to point out because, as you know, I made a video about the lordship of Ireland. We also talked about the earldom of Ulster, but we will have to talk more about probably the English conquest and further, occupation of the island. This had been quite relevant. It had been a sort of, alternative for Wales, right? Normally not the most, the most direct heirs were sent to Ireland, but at some point, for example, the same Edward's grandfather, John of England, was the favorite of Henry II, who had also initiated the conquest of Ireland, actually gave the government of the English territory to him. And it was, of course, an important source of revenues, in spite of the generally wild background of the place. There were lots of important resources, soldiers, and funds extracted from the Irish possessions. Many of these were sent to Gascony, Wales, Scotland, Flanders. Right, this is an overlooked aspect. How many also Irish warriors were sent? Like we mostly start thinking at this point the Welsh, who also were used, in fact, against the Irish in Ireland. But there were lots of Irish forces too, like in English armies of this time already. Edward was quite exploitator of Ireland, as you understand also from the general necessity of resources we have highlighted during his conquests and so on. Now the problem is that the English government of Ireland had become a bit of a mess because most of the decentralized position, the local officials, representatives were largely corrupt. You know that historically in Ireland you have the creation probably of a Anglo-Gaelic sentiment that was at times even opposite to the central government in Dublin, and of course, I mean the one of London, of course. So, very interesting picture. We didn't talk about it so much, but we'll come back on it. We also talked a lot about medieval Irish warfare, so that can also give a better idea of the context. There were attempts to reform the Irish administration in the comprehensive one that Edward, as we've seen, had carried out for the rest of his domains. These occurred specifically in 1272. However, we realized that the situation was more complicated. Record keeping, for example, remained inadequate. We also have less sources to begin with about Ireland. We know, however, that the situation was turbulent. There wasn't much of clear lordships, governance, direction. There were lots of different clans that hated each other, gods, and mobilized. In fact, probably Gaelic clans outside of this concrete English control in these wars. There was the introduction of indentured military service by Irish magnates around 1290, which of course was met with some resistance locally. Edward also was obliged to neglect Ireland compared to other theaters, especially as far as the Scottish wars escalated. Later on there would be probably a Scottish invasion of Ireland to further undermine English rule, even though it didn't really go anywhere. But the upkeeping of Irish castles, bridges, and roads was neglected by the monarchy, causing thus a general decadence also of its grip on Ireland. All English and also Welsh and in part also Irish, as we've seen, and even French forces were concentrated in Wales, in Scotland, and on the continent as well, contributing to the lack of deterrence from the side of the Lord of Ireland, and therefore the increase in violence, in lawlessness, and in the general decadence of the system. There were general oppositions to the so-called purvenances that had to do with grain supplies that were exacted from Ireland. There was a great speculation in and inflation relatively to the basic goods prices. There was an attempt to forgive the lawbreakers in exchange, however, for a service in England, which was something that naturally many Irish they weren't looking forward to, and we're talking probably also English people. I mean, the English lords that now, yes, had settled there from a long time often, but that in fact didn't have much interest to come back to Britain. Also considering that Ireland was that sort of far west that had always been like that. I mean, always been much less regulated reality, where many lords had settled exactly to escape central control. There were also, in this case, English lords in Ireland before the English conquest of Ireland by Henry II. So it was basically an unmitigated disaster, even though, of course, Ireland was so secondary, even tertiary in the broader international picture for England. All right. This brought to some general destabilization. For example, people moving, looting, general violence. There was even comeback of Gaelic Irish identity during this period as a consequence. Right. Some of the same English settlers were absorbed further by the general, conflicts that were ever more led by the Gaels. Edward was not particularly tolerant towards the Irish, as we've seen. He thought really poorly of the Celtic fringe, and of course of Ireland worst of all. So there was no interest, for example, in allowing or at least sanctioning, backing the use of Gaelic law. On the contrary, this was condemned by Edward in 1277 as, this is quite funny and sort of enucleating the English idea of the Irish, quote, displeasing to God and to reason, which is basically the entire foundation of law. If you think about it, especially in the 13th century, God and reason is basically like the old natural theological foundation of law and the law of people. So equally, the Irish were basically understood as subhumans. And objectively, the divide with England was shocking, to say the least. Now, by the time of the 1297 Irish Parliament, there were some attempts to negotiate, right, to say not to press too hard, and so this actually led Gaelic customs and law to spread. Considered many communities had been deserted, lands and villages had been abandoned, and in part, the Gaels from the hinterland of the island sort of took advantage of this. Again, Irish history is quite fascinating, but it's also that wild. I mean, there is no other way of terming it. I mean, Scotland, in comparison, it's a highly civilized land, and it's really shocking to think how even, of course, we can learn from the rest of history, because everything changes too. Now, I'm just checking how many videos about. Alright, medieval Ireland. Probably not too many, but 11 videos. I thought even less, but they are a few, and some are also fairly old. Some are not technically even about Ireland. I mean, the Battle of Brunanburh, yes, okay, but it was just because there were some Irish in it. It was very British, very English even thing. And however, like step by step, we are completing a lot of stuff. I'm pleased to see that there are ever more external views of the channel. I mean, people are discovering that I'm being used as source by different sites, we're spreading. Any kind of help, of course, in that is extremely welcome, because that's the point. Like, Schwerpunkt has a very high level of engagement, but if you consider how much is really uploaded on YouTube every day, you realize how crazy it is to think to even emerge. So I'm very thankful to have more than 23,000 subscribers, but we both have to work harder, right? We have really to do a lot, and therefore let's spread this stuff far and wide. We'll create more playlists, we'll do more, I will place more relevance on so many different aspects. Let's do this together, right? Let's break the mold. We came so far, right? It's a pity just to give up. I have no interest in doing so, but consider that the more we do and the more we're motivated, also from my side. So this is really for the future. We'll keep talking about Edward I because it's not over yet. His reign is so dense and rich. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.